One of our core issues, we litigate in 4 areas: school choice, private property rights, economic liberty, and free speech. What I'm here to talk about today is the private property rights, and specifically in that area, we litigate in the area of eminent domain abuse. We're the nation's leading advocate against the abuse of eminent domain, and what that means. Most of you have probably heard of the Kelo case, which is what I'm going to talk about today. What you might not know is that we actually represented the homeowners in the Kelo case, Suzette Kelo and some of her neighbors in New London. Unfortunately, we lost the case, and the U.S. Supreme Court held that the Fifth Amendment does not prevent the government from taking private property and transferring it to other private homeowners. But before we get too far into the discussion, let's talk about actually what the term eminent domain means. This is a definition from Black's Law Dictionary. It defines eminent domain as the power to take private property for public use by the state, municipalities, and private persons or corporations, authorized to exercise functions of public character. In other words, it's the power of the government to seize your property and use it for its own uses. The power of eminent domain is an inherent aspect of government power. It's been around since the nation's founding. And it's a huge, awesome power. The U.S. Supreme Court has actually described it as the despotic power. It's so powerful. Because it's so destructive and so capable of being abused, our founders put 2 important limitations into our Constitution in the Fifth Amendment. The Fifth Amendment provides that nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. If you look at this, there's 2 very important limitations here. First, if the government takes your property, it has to pay you, has to give you just compensation. But more importantly, the government can only take your property if it's for a public use. The second limitation is totally important because you don't even get to compensation unless it first is a public use. Now, historically, and when people think of public use, there are things like roads and courthouses and schools and post offices, all the things that the public uses and needs to have a just and good society. More recently though, and in the last 50 years specifically, the notion of public use has started to become eroded, and it's expanded to the point that public use really doesn't mean what it used to mean, and it doesn't mean what people can use and enjoy as a public. Now property is routinely transferred from one private property owner to another. The Institute for Justice did a study, and we looked at the years 1998 through 2002. And what we found is across the country, there's more than 10,000 cases of actual or threatened condemnation for private development. What that means is that the government took private property and transferred it to another private property owner for things like big box condominiums and stores and things like that. And in 2005, in the Kelo case, the U.S. Supreme Court gave the ultimate endorsement to that notion. The house is being torn down. The kind of the backstory, this happened in 2005. The most recent developments, first of all, they obviously came in and bulldozed everything, the whole neighborhood that's been around for probably close to 100 years.
Where is New London?
Connecticut. Yes. So, and again, nice little waterfront town, beautiful little historic area there. Houses that were probably built in the 1950s, but not dilapidated or run down by any means, just older homes. They demolished all the homes for Pfizer Corporation. That was the organization. They wanted to build their headquarters there. Housing would probably be developed in, a whole revitalization. So they bulldozed everything. In last year, Pfizer announced it had pulled out completely. So they flattened everything, and their planned development never happened. And they're here, but under the community renewal law, blight is defined so broadly that literally any piece of property in the state of Washington can be called blighted. Okay, so here's a picture of what we typically think of as blight.
Wow, that's the rooming house my folks
So the community renewal law arises from a fad after World War II. A lot of folks viewed poor people as a disease, and actually the term blight is lifted from agricultural terms and describes diseases that slowly spread and slowly destroy crops. So that's the thinking here, that blight, if allowed to persist in a neighborhood or an area, will spread and all of a sudden, the whole city will become run down and dilapidated. In 1963, this fad of eradicating blight found acceptance in our state when the Washington Supreme Court held that condemning taking the property of blighted areas for redevelopment and transferring those areas to private entities such as developers is just fine. It doesn't violate Article 1, Section 16. But in Seattle, these houses, that's a blighted house right there. These are blighted, and these are blighted.
terrible.
I know, aren't they terrible? Yeah. Washington Community, the Community Renewal Law has a definition of blight. Let's look at that on the next screen. This is the definition of blight. This is lifted directly out of our state law, RCW 3581-015. This is one area of the blight definition that have all of these little subsections. So mixed use of land or buildings. So I see a mixed use here. We're in a restaurant and there's houses across the street. So this is blighted. Inadequate street layout. So the planners don't like the way the streets are laid out. Faulty lot layout. Excessive land coverage. What that means is that your house is too big and your lot is too small. Restaurant, and there's that house, so they could come up and down and take this whole street. I don't know where their power would stop. They could take the whole area. So as this makes clear, Washington law defines blight to include things that property owners have no control over. I mean, you can't clean up your house or your yard if your house is just simply too big on the piece of property, according to a government bureaucrat. To take private property and give it to private entities. We weren't sure, so we did a huge Public Records Act request. The Institute for Justice, we submitted requests to every city with a population greater than 5,000 people in the state of Washington, as well as every county and housing authority. Housing authorities have this power too, to take private property. To see if they'd use this law since the year 2000. I took all that data and I took about a year of my time and sifted through it, and we found amazing results. Since the year 2000, more than 48,000 Washingtonians were threatened to have their houses taken by eminent domain for projects that did not expressly foreclose eminent domain to transfer them to private entities. So the projects involved basically didn't say we're not going to use eminent domain, we're going to leave that option open to us. The cities of Auburn, Bremerton, Renton, Seattle, Tukwila, and Walla Walla all took significant steps to use this law for economic development. Seattle and Renton specifically attempted to blight thousands and thousands of homes, and they were only stopped when citizen activists mobilized and said, "You're not going to take our house."